Around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, with its efficient long legs, became our first hominin ancestor to leave Africa, reaching all the way to Europe, China and Indonesia. Then around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens came into being, also in Africa, and its migration was even more impressive. Based on a bottleneck in the DNA history of all non-Africans, which we'll get into, it is estimated that a small group of Homo sapiens left Africa between 50 and 70,000 years ago, spreading around the world and becoming ancestors of all today's non-Africans. This story worked perfectly until evidence emerged of Homo sapiens outside of Africa before 70,000 years ago. And this only makes sense if we assume that these early lineages died out, leaving no trace in modern DNA. And indeed, we now also have evidence of a Neanderthal from 100,000 years ago, who through interbreeding obtained some human DNA. And as predicted, this human DNA inside that Neanderthal does not appear in today's human populations. Recent evidence shows that humans reached Indonesia by 67,000 years ago and Australia by 65,000 years ago. And the migration to Australia was especially challenging, as it required a 90-kilometer sea journey. The populating of the Americas was relatively late, as it required travel in the Arctic. It did help that the Bering Strait between Russia and Alaska had dried up during the Ice Age. But a large glacier in North America blocked the way. Originally, it was assumed that humans waited until 13,000 years ago, when a gap opened up in the ice sheet, allowing them to travel south. But then evidence showed that Monteverde, all the way in South Chile, was already reached by 14.6 thousand years ago, clearly before the opening up of the ice sheets, meaning that an earlier wave likely traveled along the coast around the ice sheet, reaching the Americas earlier. Only much later did the Canadian Arctic and Greenland get populated by the so-called Paleo-Eskimos, the ancestors of the Inuit. And even later, starting in Taiwan, the faraway islands of Polynesia, including New Zealand, Hawaii and Easter Island, were reached. So we got a lot to get to, and if this material is valuable to you, then please subscribe and let's start. Around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, with its surprisingly long legs compared to its ancestors, was able to travel out of Africa. It reached Europe and even China and Indonesia, but not Australia and the Americas. Homo sapiens, our own species, also migrated out of Africa and managed to populate all inhabitable places on Earth. And recent DNA research can help us reconstruct this migration. We can start as follows. By comparing mutations between the peoples living today, we can reconstruct a family tree of our species. And from this it was found that the deepest branches of humanity are all found in sub-Saharan Africa, suggesting that our ancestors came from Africa. Within that sub-Saharan branch, the earliest branch is found in the present-day San hunter-gatherers of South Africa. And the Pygmies in Central Africa were also early. Our DNA origin in Africa matches with archaeology, with all early anatomically modern skeletons dating from 300 to 200,000 years ago coming from Africa. For instance, 5 early individuals who still had some archaic features have recently been found in Morocco dating to 300,000 years ago. They look modern, except that the cranium was still oval and not round. And the Homo 1 cranium was found in Ethiopia, dating to 233,000 years ago, and this does have a modern round profile. Based on the study of only mitochondrial DNA, shortened as mtDNA, which passes down only through the female line, it has been found that all humans today have an African female ancestor from about 160,000 years ago. This person has been called the mitochondrial Eve, the mother of all humans alive today. This, by the way, does not mean that she was the first female of our species, but only that all humans today have her as an ancestor, while all the other lineages at the time died off. And secondly, the ancestor not only for our mitochondrial DNA, but for our whole genome, has much older ancestors. Most genes have a common ancestor dating back 5 to 1 million years ago, and none of them more recent than 320,000 years ago. And this, by the way, does not mean that those genes came into being around that time, but only that all modern humans are the ancestor of a person who at that time had that gene. And now comes the great revelation. If we look only at non-Africans, many of our genes show a common ancestor around 19 to 50,000 years ago. And this suggests a low population at the time, also called a bottleneck. From this, it was concluded that all non-Africans derived from this small population that left Africa between 90 and 50,000 years ago, which was later refined to 70 to 50,000 years ago. At first glance, this would suggest that no modern humans left Africa before this time. But archaeologists have since found a few older fossils outside of Africa. For instance, the near-complete crania from the Skull Cave and the Kafse Cave in Israel, dating between 130 and 100,000 years ago. And these must have been lineages from an earlier wave that died out. Recently, another example was found in Greece from even earlier, 210,000 years ago, and another one in Israel from between 190 and 180,000 years ago. DNA of these early Homo sapiens outside of Africa will be very valuable to confirm that they were indeed part of an earlier wave, but that has not been obtained so far. Some evidence, however, has come from interbreeding with Neanderthals. A human, the study showed, contributed to the genes of a Neanderthal, living in the Altai Mountains around 100,000 years ago. And as predicted, the DNA of this human did not contribute to modern human populations. On the flip side, Neanderthal DNA has also been found in modern humans. And from this, it was found that Neanderthals interbred with non-Africans, although not with Africans. Today, non-Africans have between 1.5 and 2.1% of Neanderthal DNA, with the East Asians on the higher side and the Europeans on the lower side. These are small numbers, just a few percent. But if we add up all the different pieces of Neanderthal DNA spread out over the population, it adds up to about 20% of the entire Neanderthal genome. So that's quite substantial. Now again we add some nuance. If we study the genome of European skeletons before the introduction of farming into Europe, they almost have the same amount of Neanderthal DNA as Asians, although today it's lower. And this can be explained by a group that separated from the non-Africans prior to interbreeding with Neanderthals. And this group, without Neanderthal DNA, has been called the basal Eurasians. Now at this moment, this group, the basal Eurasians, are still a ghost population, meaning we have no archaeological evidence for them, but DNA shows that they should have existed somewhere in the area. This DNA mixed with the early farmers, who then migrated from the Near East into Europe, diluting the European Neanderthal ancestry. Interestingly, a skeleton from Romania from 40,000 years ago shows 6 to 9% Neanderthal ancestry, which is way above average. And it is estimated that this person had Neanderthals in its family tree no more than 6 generations back. Humans also interbred with the so-called Denisovans, and this DNA turns up most strongly in the natives of New Guinea, the Philippines and Australia. This population has between 3 and 6% Denisovan DNA and about 2% Neanderthal DNA. giving a total between 5 and 8% of non-human DNA, which is the highest in the world. And by the way, it was once assumed that the people from Australia and New Guinea might also have come from an earlier out of Africa wave, because genetically they look a bit more different than the rest. However, if we correct for interbreeding with Denisovans, it was found that they come out of the same out of Africa population. When studying DNA, we can also calculate when this interbreeding occurred. And this is done based on that the ancestor's DNA gets chopped up into smaller and smaller bits over the generations. For Neanderthals, their interbreeding with humans occurred between 54 and 49,000 years ago, and for Denisovans it was between 49 and 44,000 years ago. And from this we can conclude something interesting. The Neanderthals must have interbred before the split between Europeans and East Asians. And the Denisovans interbred before the forming of the Papuan, New Guinean and Australian peoples. And this must all have happened between those two intervals, 55 and 49, and 49 to 44,000 years ago, with on average a span of just 5,000 years ago. Now let's compare the DNA research to the archaeological record. Europe might have been populated as early as 54,000 years ago, based on the discovery of a modern human tooth in France, found in 2022. And these early humans also, it seems, left no genes in modern populations. And this is for instance confirmed with a 45,000-year-old Czech genome. The next oldest Homo sapien remains from Europe come from Britain, dating to 44,000 years ago. And then finally a second wave came in around 37,000 years ago, and these did contribute to the modern populations. Now to China. There 47 human teeth were recovered, dating between 120 and 80,000 years ago, and a jaw dating to 110,000 years ago. And these also must have been an earlier wave. And then Indonesia, in 2025, hand stencils were found on a cave wall in Indonesia, dated to 67.8 thousand years ago. And these are the earliest cave paintings in the world. Now 67.8 is technically after 70,000. So these might have belonged to a very quick out of Africa wave, or they might have been an earlier wave. Prior to 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens from East Asia also reached the Tibetan Plateau, reaching a height of 4,600 meters. The Denisovans had been here before, around 160,000 years ago, and it has been shown that the Tibetans inherited a mutation through interbreeding with them that adapted their red blood cells to live at these high altitudes. Thus far, this was all territory that was already covered by Homo erectus. But soon, Homo sapiens also entered new territory, namely Japan, Australia and the Americas. By 38,000 years ago, Homo sapiens seems to have been the first hominins to reach Japan. And interestingly, some stone tools and hooks show similarities to those found in the Americas, showing the connection between East Asia and the Americas. But unfortunately, no DNA from Japan has been obtained. Reaching Australia was quite a challenge, as it requires at least one sea journey out of sight of land, likely covering around 90 kilometers, so quite substantial. The oldest human burials in Australia date to 42,000 years ago, and this seemingly included a cremation, one of the oldest in the world. Before this time, no well-dated skeletons remain, and this fitted well with the out of Africa theory. But then some stone tools were found at the Machet Bebe rock shelter that have been dated back as far back as 65,000 years ago, making some archaeologists very uneasy. This is again a bit too close to the out of Africa dispersal between 70 and 50,000 years ago. And it is also not in line with those interbreeding events just mentioned, between 49 and 44,000 years ago with Denisovans. For we've just learned that the Denisovan interbreeding preceded the Australian settlement. And DNA evidence will eventually have to show if we are here also dealing with a small pre-Denisovan early migration. And now, America. The populating of the Americas was relatively late because it required the crossing of the Arctic, which of course was a challenge, especially during the Ice Age. Helpful, however, was that during the Ice Age, the Bering Strait between eastern Russia and Alaska, which is today about 85 kilometers long, had dried up because of the lower sea levels, forming the Bering Land Bridge. The oldest evidence of human presence in the Arctic has been found at the SK Mammoth site in the central Siberian Arctic, so not close to the Bering Bridge, and it dates to around 45,000 years ago. And here we find evidence of a mammoth being butchered by humans. The Yana RHS site gives the oldest evidence of humans in eastern Siberia, dated to between 34 and 32,000 years ago. And here we found human artifacts and also the remains of at least 31 woolly mammoths. And then there are the Blue Fish Caves, all the way in western Canada, so at the other side of the Bering Strait, and they show stone tool butcher marks dating to 24,000 years ago, some of the oldest evidence of human occupation in the Americas. Once in America, the migrants were faced with a giant wall of glacial ice that covered much of North America. Originally, it was assumed there was no way to continue until a gap opened up in the ice sheet, a so-called ice-free corridor, and this happened around 15,000 years ago. Although this gap became habitable for plants and animals around 13,000 years ago. Directly beyond this path, archaeologists have found a 12.6 thousand year old infant located in Montana and associated with stone tools of the Clovis culture that became dominant in North America. For a long time it was believed that this Clovis culture was related to that earliest migration into America, and this became the Clovis first model. Recently, however, evidence from pre-Clovis is piling up. The best evidence comes from Monteverde, all the way to the south in Chile, and is dated to 14.6 thousand years ago, definitely before the ice-free corridor, and also 16,000 kilometers from the Bering Strait. And the tools from here were not of the Clovis type. It was then assumed that the early Americans traveled via the coast around the ice sheet around 16,000 years ago. But then, even older human artifacts, dating to as much as 18,500 years ago, were found at Monteverde, although these dates are not universally accepted. But in the last few years, more and more old dates keep popping up. For instance, the Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas dates to 16,000 years ago. And in New Mexico, 61 preserved human footprints are dated to around 20,000 years ago. A date that, by the way, has been verified by remeasurement in 2023. So this seems to be quite secure. And controversially again, at the Chiquihuite cave in Mexico, a large number of stone tools are dated between 26 and 19,000 years ago, with some more controversial parts even dating to 33,000 years ago. But many scholars doubt these very early dates, wondering if people could have had enough time to migrate from eastern Siberia, with the oldest finds from 34,000 years ago, to reach Mexico by 33,000 years ago. That seems a bit unlikely. But again, this field is transforming very quickly, so we'll likely find out more soon. The current hypothesis, although not set in stone, is that people reached the Russian Arctic around 43,000 years ago, then Alaska by perhaps 26,000 years ago, and then they moved south by 22,000 years ago. This model also roughly agrees with DNA evidence. The remains of two small children from the Upward Sun River site in Alaska, from before 11.5 thousand years ago, possess DNA that is closely related to almost all the Native Americans outside of the Arctic, and their lineage diverged from Northeast Asians around 36,000 years ago. Then it is found that some gene flow between this early American branch and Eastern Russia continued for up to 10,000 years, so until 25,000 years ago, and then they largely separated. So this matches quite well. But then there are further complications. Some skeletons from the Amazon, for instance one from 11.5 thousand years ago from Brazil, look more like those from Australia and New Guinea compared to the other Native Americans. And in fact, some people in the Amazon still have a small percentage of this Australian New Guinean DNA. This mysterious population is now called Population Y, and some believe it presents an earlier wave into America, who also came via the Bering Land Bridge. And they might be related to the 44,000-year-old Qian Yuan individual from China, who also has a genome slightly related to Australian and Papuan populations. Then much later, around 6,000 years ago, there came yet another wave into America, the Paleo-Eskimos, who became the first to populate the Canadian Arctic and Greenland. Evidence for this comes, for instance, from a frozen hare from Greenland from 4,000 years ago. And then the following strange conclusion. Curiously, genetics also showed that Europeans are more closely related to Native Americans than to East Asians, something that was not at all expected. From this, the geneticist David Reich predicted the existence of a population that he called the ancient North Eurasians, with some of them migrating to Europe and some of them to eastern Siberia, where they mixed with East Asians. At the time this was still a ghost population, but then in 2013 a boy with this ancestry was found at the Malta site in south-central Siberia from around 24,000 years ago. Its genome made it clear that the Native Americans derived a third of their ancestry from those ancient North Eurasians and the rest from East Asia, explaining why European DNA has more affinities with Native Americans than with the Asians, because those ancient North Eurasians mixed with both the Europeans and the Native Americans. Finally, some interesting mentions. The Fels Cave at the southern tip of South America, namely at Tierra del Fuego, shows human artifacts from around 10,000 years ago, and this is some 17,000 kilometers from the Bering Strait. And in southern Peru, at an elevation of 4,355 meters, evidence of occupation goes back to between 12.8 and 11.5 thousand years ago. And there we have it, the great migrations of Homo sapiens to the end of the earth. In the next lecture, we'll study the early culture of Homo sapiens, including the transcendental cave paintings of animals, sometimes combined with mysterious half-human, half-animal hybrids, and also the Venus figurines, which show the female figure with exaggerated fertility markers, yet with their faces often left blank. And finally, we'll discuss the elaborate burials from Sangir, Russia, dated to 34,000 years ago, with one grave of 2 teenagers containing mammoth tusks and about 5,000 mammoth ivory beads that must have taken thousands of hours to make. But that is for the next time. For now, I hope you were inspired. And if you want to know more about our early history or any other topic from world history, then read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. And of course, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.